The 1970s and 1980s are also going to witness a winding down of the Cold War. And part of this is brought about by the political, the military, the economic inequalities that grow up between the democratic West and the communist East. It's very difficult for the control economies of the East to be innovative, to keep up with the developments and the expansion of Western growth. And just trying to produce basic products, household products, sanitary products, consumer conveniences, proves beyond the economic capacity of the East. As this happens, and as the cost of maintaining this massive modern military structure becomes overwhelming, we're going to find the Cold War winding down and the Soviet Union the clear loser. Though just how great the West's victory was is a little bit debatable. One of the first things that we see begin to be challenged, that Berlin Wall, that division of Germany. Germany had been a centerpiece, an icon of the Cold War for decades. The division of Germany in the 1940s had been controversial. In the early 1960s, the Soviets had overseen the building of a literal physical wall to divide the divided city of Berlin. And that wall had become a focal point of the Cold War competition between East and West, between democracy and the communists. And it had also been a fairly clear comparison point between the success of a democratic Western Germany and the challenges in a communist East Germany. By the late 1980s, there are calls for the wall to be done away with. There are calls from both within and outside of Germany. East Germany is demanding more autonomy on its own. In 1989, the Germans take it upon themselves, and taking advantage of a miscommunication in a government memo opening up the wall, or opening up the gateways in the walls for a weekend, German citizens simply take the wall apart. They charge the wall themselves, and in this instance, the tanks aren't sent in, and the people are allowed to do what they want. And the wall comes down. The wall is the victim. East and West Germany reunite. Over the next year and a half, East and West Germany are going to become a single country again. Not without difficulty. There's a lot of economic disparity, and there are a lot of issues to work through. But a united Germany is going to be the center of Europe once again. Following this, and in conjunction with it, Germany was just one of a number of nations that were challenging Soviet control. Poland also had been lobbying very hard to open up its own power within the Soviet system. Dock workers in the port city of Gdansk had gone on strike, had demanded their own labor unions. They didn't just want the directives from the Workers' Republic, the Workers' Front of the Central Soviet government, and their demands are given into. Likewise, you're going to see countries like Czechoslovakia, you're going to see Hungary, you're going to see other Eastern Bloc nations demanding their rights, pulling away, so that by 1991, the old Soviet bloc, the Warsaw Pact, has come unglued, and the Soviets simply do not have the power to charge in and knock it down. In fact, in 1992, we're going to see that the Soviet Union itself can't even maintain unity, and individual elements of it are going to split off. This had all been sort of presaged by a gradual opening. In the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union had seen new leadership come to power, a new generation of leadership, importantly. Mikhail Gorbachev takes control. He's several decades younger than the last leaders of the Soviet Union. He opens up with ideas of openness and modernization. It's reform, but it's reform that's a little too late and a little too slow. Gorbachev can't even stay in charge of the revolution that he opens the door on. And the hero that we see arise in Moscow in 1991, 1992 is Boris Yeltsin, who takes over from Mikhail Gorbachev, who wanted to reform but maintain the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapses, Yeltsin is able to take over the federation that follows and lead it into sort of a new world of capitalistic competition and markets that are open and exploitable, and the problems that follow along with that. In the West, where you might see a lot of victory celebrations, a lot of happiness, victory in the Cold War, what you're going to see instead is a hard turn to the right in many cases. It's been an expensive war. The economic success of the 60s and 70s has leveled off. It's not that consumer demand isn't still there, it's just that most people have cars, most people have appliances, most people have, and now they're purchasing to replace rather than creating huge new demands for new. And what this means is that the economies of the West have slowed down. As they have slowed down, it has become more difficult for Western governments to maintain the same sort of services, the same sort of tax base that they had been able to do in the past. This leads to the election of right-wing governments. In Great Britain, we see the prime ministership of Margaret Thatcher, and a right-wing government that takes back government services to the people, privatizes old government interests in industry, in healthcare, in places like this. In the United States, the presidency of Ronald Reagan follows a very similar line. But along with this collapse of the Soviet system and the Eastern Bloc and the whole Cold War, we're also going to see a return of even further right-wing politics, issues that hadn't been expected in the wake of the Cold War. Nationalistic issues, racial issues, cultural divides, immigration questions, all of these become pressing problems for Western democratic nations. We see the worst of this breakdown in the old Balkan region of southeastern Europe, in Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, in Serbia, and regions like this, where ethnic divisions and religious divisions, linguistic divisions, cultural divisions wind up leading to brutal civil wars, and wars that introduce a whole new term to our lexicon of political behavior, and that's ethnic cleansing. The idea of attempting to eliminate a whole group of people because of what they believe, or where they're from, or the way that they look, or the things that they practice. And this kind of intolerance and hard nationalism, rigid national identification, becomes a hallmark and a feature of this period as well. Now, the end of the Cold War is given sort of an overall summary by a historian named Francis Fukuyama, who says this is the end of history, that the Cold War had been the last clash, that democracy had been successful, and that the world would now move on into a happier, consumeristic, capitalistic sort of paradise. Clearly, you are living in the aftermath of this situation, and it hasn't worked out quite that way. Certainly, there's been plenty of history since 1991, 1992, and not all of it needs a Cold War backdrop or an obvious either-or choice to it.